So, welcome to our Roots Chris Bible study. As always, I want to thank our hosts here. I want to thank Jeff and the staff here that helped make this possible. And especially today, the stew or the soup that they serve today is my favorite thing that they serve here. I love it. My eyes light up when I come in and see it. So we're going to read later in Genesis where Esau is going to sell his birthright for a thing of red stew. And I think that's the recipe that he used. But thanks for having us. Welcome back. If you missed last week, or if you know somebody that misses this week, I'm recording us. Somebody donated a camera to the ministry of Disciple Dojo, so I can record the sessions, and then I'll usually try to upload it either today or tomorrow onto my website, discipledojo.org. And if you're on Facebook, facebook.com/discipledojo. So I'll put it up there, and it's 30 minutes each week. You can catch up, and that way if you do have to miss a week, or if you have to leave early, or for whatever reason, you can kind of stay with us as we go along, as we're reading through Genesis. So, we're in Genesis 13 this week. Last week, Genesis 12. And last week, we saw how Abram has been promised. Genesis 12, he was promised some things. What was he promised? Do you remember? We're going to drill this almost every time. You got to remember this promise to Abram, because like I said, it's foundational to the Bible. Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. What were the promises God made to Abram?
I'll make you a great nation.
I'll make you a great nation. What else?
Bless thee.
I'll bless you. What else? I'll make your name great. What? I'll bless those who bless you. Those who curse you, I will curse. What's the last one? Yes, through you. All the nations of the earth, all the families of the earth, all those nations that spread out in Genesis 10 all over the world and turned to other gods, all the nations like Babylon that God had called Abram out of, all the nations of the world would be blessed through this promise that God's making to Abram. Now this week in 13, God's going to reaffirm the promise, and He's going to specify again, and then He'll do it again in chapter 15. So He's going to reveal a little bit more of the promise and make it a little more concrete each time. Now, the first time He made the promise to Abram was right after Abram had separated from his family. When God said, go, leave your father's household, leave everything, the land that I'll show you. So there was this separation in faith, and then God makes this promise, and then Abram was to look throughout and walk throughout the land, and all of that would be the land that God gave him. And then it ends with Abram building an altar and worshiping the Lord. Everything's going great. Then, in chapter 12 last week, what does Abram do? There's a famine in the land, so he goes to... Right? Come on, interactive. I know you're Egypt. Egypt. Yeah, he goes to Egypt. Goes down to Egypt, takes his smoking hot wife Sarah, and the king of Egypt says, bring her to me. I like this one. Right? Now, remember, Sarai at this time, she's in her 60s, 70s, and she's still turning heads in Egypt, so that's pretty impressive. But the king takes her, and Abram kind of lets it slide. Says, I'll tell him you're my sister, which isn't technically a lie, because she was his half-sister, but it was not the truth. And so God actually strikes Egypt with a plague, it says. And Pharaoh, as a result of seeing the plague, basically goes to Abram and says, what are you doing? Why did you say this is your sister? This is your wife. Take her. Go. Get out of here. And sends him out with even more riches than he came down in with. Now, that story in Genesis 12 is Israel's history in the next part, or the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, in microcosm. Because Israel, as a nation, is going to experience the same thing. They're going to go down to Egypt through a famine during the time of Joseph. They're going to stay in Egypt. Then, when they start to get oppressed, they're going to cry out to God. God's going to strike Egypt with a plague. Eventually, after this wrestling match between the gods of Egypt and the God of Israel, Pharaoh's going to send them out, kick them out, and the Egyptians are going to load them up with goods and money and everything, and just send them out and say, go, get out. And some of the believing Egyptians are actually going to come out with Israel and become part of Israel. People like Caleb, who you'll read about in the Bible later. So they're going to come, and then they're going to come back into the land that God had promised. So Abram's sort of living out the history of Israel in preview form. so to speak, in his life. So, but we ended in 12, he left Egypt, and then in 13, verse 1, it says, Then Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, which is the southern desert between Israel and Egypt. He and his wife and all he had, and Lot with him, Lot's his nephew. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. He went by stages from the Negev to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had formerly been. In other words, he went back to where he was in chapter 12, verses 8 and 9. He's come home, back to where he was. And just like there, verse 4, to the site where he had built the altar, Abram worshiped the Lord there. So it's back on track. The promise that was in jeopardy of Abram having an offspring through Sarai, who the blessing would then be transmitted to, is now back on track. They're back in the land. He's back with basically his people, his possessions, and things are good. So the blessing that was in jeopardy is now safe for a minute, because now we're going to see what happens. Verse 5. Now Lot, who was traveling with Abram, also had flocks, herds, and tents. Lot was a rich fellow as well. But the land was unable to support them as long as they stayed together, for they had so many possessions that they could not stay together. There was quarreling between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now, pause there for a second. We like to think of Father Abraham as this lonely guy wandering around in the desert. You know, old Abraham and his beard, and Sarah's wife, and that's just it. Think of Abram more as like a CEO or a vast rancher or herdsman. He has a lot of stuff. He is notable in his wealth. And Lot is the same way. Lot's also wealthy. They don't travel alone. They would have their servants and all their animals and the people to look after their animals, different under-shepherds. And all. This is it's a little community. It's not just Abram hanging out by his tent in the desert. There's a lot of people involved in this. So much so that in this land, Lot's hired workers and Abram's hired workers start to get into quarrels with each other. Because of, hey, I'm supposed to be grazing this area today with Abram's sheep. No, my master Lot told me I'm supposed to be grazing with the sheep here. You have to go over there. And for us, it's, we live in a population density that's far beyond anything that they could imagine then. But for back then, things like land and grazing rights and the rights to wells, water sources, were things that people would actually fight and kill over. I mean, you have to really try to step back and put yourself in the mind of the ancient Near East herdsman, livestock owner, and things like where you graze, where you go, who's got the rights to this well, who's got the rights to this pasture land. Incredibly important, and they were actually life or death issues. So it's not like you don't get the sense that these shepherds were just like, hey, this is our turf, and like the Jets and the Sharks, right? Like, oh no, you better step up. It's not like that at all. It's like I think everybody in here is old enough to catch that right. It's not like that, though. It's hey, this is our livelihood, and this is our livelihood, and we can't both mesh here. The land can't support us. So, here's where the problem comes in. Abram had already been told, this is the land I'm going to give you. And he'd already gone to Egypt and experienced bad stuff and come back. And it's kind of like God saying, no, this is the land I've given you. But look what he said. At the end of verse 7, at that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land. Canaanites. Remember that term. Whenever you see Canaanites, it's a foreshadowing of bad things that are going to happen. In this case, it'll be in the future. Verse 8, Abram said to Lot, okay, please, let's not have quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, since we're relatives. Isn't the whole land before you? Separate from me. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. All right? Now, this is Abram, and it's not, you don't get the sense of his willingness. I mean, he's a nice man. He's very much non-confrontational. Hey, tell the king of Egypt you're my sister. I don't want any trouble. Okay, Lot, you take whatever you want. I don't want any trouble. Right? It's very, you could read this as either he's sort of spineless, or you could read it as he's gracious. And I've heard sermons preached both ways. The point is, though, however, God had told him, this is going to be your land where I'm going to plant you. And now, again, that blessing is in jeopardy by Abram basically letting Lot choose the land that he wants. and saying, you go wherever you go. So if Lot had said, okay, cool, I want Canaan, Abram would have to leave. So it's a very interesting moment, whether Abram was being negligent, whether he was being kind or gracious, don't know. And it's be careful of reading into the psychology of biblical figures, because a lot of times you can assume a motive that the text allows for multiple meanings. We don't know exactly what Abram was thinking, but we do know that this is not a smart move if Lot chooses the land that God had promised Abram, where his altar is built and everything. However, Lot is a little more opportunistic. Verse 10, Lot looked out and saw the entire Jordan Valley, as far as Zoar. Now that's a little, you might not know the name Zoar, but keep it in mind. Ancient Israel would be familiar with Zoar from what's going to happen in a few chapters. And so this is just a preview, a foreshadowing. So just note that name, Zoar. Saw the entire Jordan Valley as far as Zoar was well watered everywhere, like the Lord's garden, or Eden, and the land of Egypt. So Lot looks out and he sees this. Now, orientation-wise, if this is a map of Israel, and this is the Sea of Galilee up here, and this is the Dead Sea here, and the Jordan River runs down. So Abram and them are sort of down here. And Lot looks out this way, so he looks eastward. And he sees the Jordan Valley, and he sees the land down below it, the plain, and it's well watered, and it's fertile, and it's beautiful. Abram, on the other hand, is over here in sort of the hill country or the Judean area. And so that's where he is. So Lot looks out and he sees all of this, and it looks marvelous. Eastward. That term's been used many times in Genesis so far. So Lot chose the entire Jordan Valley for himself. Then Lot journeyed eastward, and they separated from each other. Mental note, whenever it talks about people going eastward, thus far in Genesis, it hasn't been a great thing. God drove them out of the garden eastward. The people that built the Tower of Babel went eastward. That term, eastward, it doesn't mean that it's not God's plan, but it sort of has connotations of getting away from God's promise. They're traveling eastward, so to speak. And all throughout the Bible later, God's presence will leave, it'll go eastward out the temple door, and it'll return. Just that's something if you ever want to study on your own, just make a note of it. But Lot goes. He takes off down to, and then here's the key. Lot chose the entire Jordan Valley for himself. Lot journeyed eastward, and they separated from each other. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, which is on this side, but Lot lived in the cities of the valley, this side, and set up his tent near Sodom. Verse 13, now the men of Sodom were evil, sinning greatly against the Lord. Here's the first foreshadowing of things that are not going to go well. Lot picked the better deal from a physical outward perspective. The land was richer, it was more well-watered, which if you're a herdsman, that's all you want is water for your flocks and your family. He picked the good land. He picked everything that looked right by outer appearances. But it notes that he went and he lived in Sodom, and it says the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked. And we're going to find out how wicked later, just in a few chapters actually. So you have them leaving, and fortunately for the promise, once again the promise is intact, because Lot chose what looked good to the eye, and Abram ends up remaining where God wanted him to be, in the land of Canaan. So, mini crisis averted, but it's going to lead to an even greater crisis for Lot and his family. Verse 14, here we go now. There's separation. Just like there was, Abram left his family. Now there's a separation. Lot, another part of Abram's family, has been removed from him. So now it whittles down even more. God appears once again and reestablishes this promise. Verse 14, after Lot had separated from him, the Lord said to Abram, look from the place you are. Look north, south, east, and west. For I will give to you and to your seed, or offspring, or descendants, depending on your translation, forever all the land that you see. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. Get up and walk from one end of the land to the other, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and went to live beside the oaks of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. Once again, God appears, makes a promise. Abram walks through the land, goes to this place, builds an altar, worships the Lord. Back on track. Things are right. God is blessing Abram now, and in the next chapter we're going to see just how extremely blessed Abram is, and that whole "I'll bless those who bless you, I'll curse those who curse you" thing is going to actually work out literally for Abram. But at this point, there's some things worth noticing. One of them is obviously Lot choosing the wealth and the bounty of the land over the promise that God had made Abram. In other words, Lot would have known, years have passed, Lot would have known about the promise to Abram. And Lot chose to go out from there, to leave the area of the promise, or the sheltering that God would provide, and step out into his own way. And it's going to have disastrous consequences for Lot, and especially for his daughters. At the same time, there's irony in this passage. There's really, if you're a biblical audience and are familiar with the land, in other words, if you lived there, you very much see the irony in verse 10. The Lord looked out and saw the entire Jordan, or Lot looked out and saw the entire Jordan Valley as far as Zoar was well watered everywhere, like the Lord's garden and the land of Egypt. And then the next line, though, says this was before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. The irony is this well-watered, beautiful land is going to be burned to a crisp in the next few chapters and become an utter wasteland, a salt waste. This is the southern shore of the Dead Sea. If you go over there now, it is not well-watered, and it is nothing like the Garden of Eden or Egypt with the Nile River and the fertile. Not at all. It's completely parched and dry and filled with salt formations from the evaporation. It's the lowest point on the earth. I mean, it is anything but paradise. And that's sort of the remaining legacy of this choice that Lot had made. What looks so good and appealing and like it would be, bountiful and wealthy, now to this day is just a salt memorial of basically the opposite of plenty of water. And the water that's there today you can't even drink because it's so salty. So there's a little bit of irony in that, and the original hearers, they knew the story already. Remember, the first audience of this book, as we have it at least, were Israel camped around Mount Sinai or camped over the plains of Moab looking into the promised land around the time of Joshua. That's the first audience who's hearing this or who's reading this or having it read to them. They know the story. They know their history. They know their ancestors, and they know that when Lot makes this decision, you can just hear the sighs, just the, Lot, you knucklehead, what are you doing? And he's going to step out, and it's going to be disastrous. The other point to mention before we draw to a close is back in verse 15, when God makes this promise to Abram. This is the second time. First one was Genesis 12, 1 through 3. This is the second time. For I will give to you and to your... What does your translation have? Okay, raise your hand if yours has seed. Okay. Raise your hand if yours has descendants. All right. Raise your hand if it's offspring. Okay. That's the range of meaning. Now this term, the Hebrew word is zerah. Z-E-R-A apostrophe, which is an untranslatable Hebrew letter. Zerah. It's a collective singular. Now, I want to mention it here because it shows up here and it's going to show up. It showed up back in Genesis 3 when God promised the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. It's like the English word sheep or fish. You can have one fish or you can have a bunch of fish. You can have one sheep, you can have a bunch of sheep. But it's also, there's a collective sense to it. You can have one thing that also is, at the same time, an entire group of things. And the Old Testament term for this, or the biblical term for this, is corporate solidarity. Corporate solidarity. So God can address the people of Israel and say, "Oh, you sons of Israel. Oh, you house of Jacob. Oh, you, my people." He can call them by their collective term. Or he can just say, "Oh, Jacob. Oh, Israel. Oh, Jerusalem." And he's referring to one person, but that one person is standing as or representing all the people collectively. And he'll say it in the famous passage when he says in the prophets, and Paul will quote it, "Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated." That gets quoted in Romans. And people think, oh, well, Jacob and Esau, they'll come a little bit later in Genesis, and they were twins, they were born, God chose Jacob rather than Esau. They say, oh, see, before they were even born, God hated Esau and he loved Jacob, and Esau was predestined to go to hell, he was reprobate, and Jacob was one of the elect, and blah, blah, blah. Nothing to do with that. The text has nothing to do with that. The prophetic text and the text Paul quotes is using corporate solidarity. It's saying, Jacob, the nation of Israel, I've chosen for my purposes, which is to bring forth the covenant. Esau, I haven't chosen. They are not the people of the promise that would bring forth the covenant promises to the world. Hebrew language of love-hate doesn't mean love and hate. When Jesus said it himself, if anybody comes to be my disciple, they must hate their father and mother. Jesus didn't mean that's a Hebrew idiom. It's a figure of speech. It's a way of saying the love that you feel for one, or the priority that you put on one, should be so high that in comparison it makes anything else look like hate, or look like rejection, or something along those lines. It's a word play. Well, this only works if there's such a thing as this term corporate solidarity. If there's a way that a person can represent a people. And this is a thing in the Old Testament that we see, and it begins here. The promise is to Abram's seed or his offspring. The promise of the land. Some people will take that and they'll say, well, there you go. That means that the Jews own the land, and that's just how it is forever. It says right here, I'll give this land to your offspring forever. But later in the Bible, you're going to get a sense of that's a very nuanced term, that some of the actual offspring of Abram are not included in the seed. Abram's offspring through Ishmael, or his offspring, Isaac's offspring through Esau. The Israelites who separated from Israel through rebellion and who were cut off from their people were not a part of this. In other words, the seed, the descendants, has as much to do with covenant obedience and faith as it does with ethnicity and who your parents were. And in fact, Jesus in the New Testament made this point. He'll say to the religious leaders, they're talking in, I think, John 8 through 10, around that area, and they'll say things like, well, what do you mean that the truth will set us free? We are free. Abraham's our father. We aren't slaves. And Jesus will say, if Abram was your father, you'd believe me. Your father's the devil, because you're doing his work. He's telling this to religious Jewish leaders. So he's saying, yeah, you may think you're part of the seed of Abram, but you're not, because it's who you are in alignment with, who you are in covenant with, who you are in relationship with. And Jesus will just flat out say, God can raise up offspring of Abram from these rocks. So the idea, when you look at Genesis, and this is important because on your table, I've gave a flyer. This is coming up in April. Take one of these with you when you go. My good friend, I mentioned it last week, my good friend Michael Brown, who's a top Messianic Jewish scholar, radio show host, conservative commentator. You've probably heard him on the radio or seen him somewhere anyway. He's a good friend of mine. We get along great. I thoroughly admire his work, and I've read a lot of what he's put out. This is an issue that he and I are going to be touching on at a debate down in Gordon-Conwell near Carowinds Boulevard in April. And one of the issues we're going to be talking about is, okay, where we are today, there's all of this conflict in the Middle East over land. Just like in Abram's day, conflict over land. And there's there's some Christians and Jews who say, right here, Genesis 13, God gave us the land forever. It's in black and white. To your offspring I give the land forever. And then there are other Christians and Jews who say, that's a pretty simplistic way of proof texting, because the rest of the Bible really nuances that idea of land possession. And particularly for Christians, the New Testament is going to have a lot to say about who is and who is not the seed of Abram. Paul is going to talk about it in Galatians and in Ephesians chapter 2. And the whole book of Revelation is going to apply all of these images and promises that were given to Israel in the Old Testament to Israel in the New Testament. But it's going to look a little different. So there's a divide among Christians. And there are groups of Christians who think, well, God made the promises to Abram and his offspring, the Jews, and they rejected Jesus. So God said, I'm smacking them out of the way and I'm starting a new thing, the church. It's called replacement theology. And so all the promises that God made to Israel in the Old Testament, he says, I'm taking it from you, Israel, and I'm giving it to you, the church. And they're spiritual promises, not literal. Okay, that's a very popular and widespread Christian view. The other group says, God said, I made these promises to Israel, and I told them that I'd bring the Messiah. And when the Messiah came, when Jesus came, they rejected him. So I'm going to put my dealings with Israel on hold. Israel, I'm going to set you over here. I'll get back to you later. You're still my covenant people. You don't need the gospel. You and I, we're tight. I'm going to do a new thing. I'm going to bring a new thing into being called the church. And it's going to grow and it's going to spread. And the promises to the church are spiritual. But when I'm done with the church, I'm going to take it out of the world. Rapture. And I'm going to get back to dealing with Israel and fulfilling the literal promises to them in the land with the nations and the kings and all of that. That's called dispensationalism. That is an equal error that Christians have held, but it's incredibly widespread. What you see, what I want to suggest, and hopefully Dr. Brown and I will get to hash this out a little bit in public, what I want to suggest is that in the Bible, the whole of the Bible, you see that the promise God made was to the seed. The offspring, the zerah. And in the Old Testament, that seed was predominantly made up of faithful ethnic Israel. But there were faithful Gentiles who were brought in and grafted into that promise. In the Old Testament, people like Ruth, right? People like Caleb. These non-Jews who were part of the zerah through their faith. Then in the New Testament, that zerah, as a tree gets higher, it gets more to a point. In the New Testament, it comes to the final seed, the ultimate seed, the only faithful Israelite, the Messiah, Jesus, the Son of David. And he, as the faithful seed, is the fulfillment and the culmination of all of the seed promises that God has made from the beginning all the way up to him. And then through him, through faith in him, he now branches out the community, grafts in Gentiles through faith, and those who continue to reject him, even though ethnically the Jewish, Paul talks about them being broken off from that tree, from that root, from that zerah. And the hope is that they will return to their Messiah. They will be grafted in, along with all the other wild branches of Gentiles who will be grafted in as well. But all along, it's one root. It's one covenant people. It's one recipient of the promise, the seed, the corporate solidarity. So that's how, it's not like God says, I'm going to take the promises from one group and give them to another group, the church. It's the promises I made to my people are still in effect, but my people now includes people from every tribe, language, people, and nation. Not people who can trace their ancestry back to a relative of Abraham. So I think it's absolutely crucial to understand this, and we're going to flesh this out, hopefully he and I in the discussion more. But as you go, I want to suggest that that's what you're seeing in the unfolding of the Bible. The promise to the seed of Abram. Is it ethnic Israel? Well, through most of the Old Testament it is. Is it still ethnic Israel in the New Testament? Largely until Gentiles start coming in mass. Then it becomes multi-ethnic Israel. And that's, I think, a better term for what the church is always intended to be. Multi-ethnic Israel. Same people, same promise, same everything. How that works now with the Jews and with the land and the Palestinians, and that's a whole other can of worms. And there are all these issues intertwined, and that's what we're going to do a whole evening devoted to. But the promise, and what I want to end with, because we have 30 seconds left, is that the promise was given to the offspring of Abram, the seed of Abram. And that promise is the continuation of what came in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. The ultimate goal of God giving the offspring of Abram the land, in this case, is for what they're going to do to the rest of the world in bringing the entire world back to God. God doesn't play favorites. He doesn't show favoritism, but he does choose specific peoples for specific purposes and gives a covenant promise that goes through a specific lineage. And that's what we're seeing in Genesis. All right? So, if you want to know more on this, I've got some of the DVD resources I sell. I've got a chapter in my book, You Want to Be Left Behind, chapter 10, all about Israel, Palestine, the land, all that stuff. Check it out. Buy some. It helps me pay bills. Other than that, have a great week. Check the website, or check my website or Facebook, Disciple Dojo, for the video that I'll try to get uploaded today or tomorrow. And we'll see you next week. Thanks.